so for the next several decades, we struggled to try and avoid being classified as jobless while trying to find a way to eat and so forth and so on. And so then we get up to the present day, and this is of course skipping a whole lot of history, but we only have a few seconds to start the conversation. And when we look at today in the most recent numbers, we know that the prison population in this country has doubled since the passage of the so-called Three Strikes Crime Bill under what Toni Morrison incredibly called the presidency of the first black president, that is Bill Clinton. I mean, I don't know what happened to Toni Morrison's brain at the time that she would say such a thing, but there are other black people who do think that Bill Clinton, matter of fact, they think Hillary Clinton is their sister. And so we have Bill Clinton advocating something called the Three Strikes Crime Bill. And this is it was really the amendment to the Omnibus Crime Bill. And so it embraced many aspects of the criminal justice system. And I want to just mention briefly how Clinton sold this Three Strikes Crime Bill to black people, because within 1 year of his presidency, Clinton appeared in Memphis, Tennessee at the last place that Dr. King gave his last speech on this earth, the church in Memphis, and standing in that same pulpit. I don't even want to I'm not going to editorialize on what I think about that. Standing in that pulpit, amongst all the black parishioners and the other people who were gathered there, he posed the question, what would Martin say if he were alive today? And arrogantly imagining that he had the answer, he in fact gave the answer. And he said, Martin would say, I died for your freedom, but look what you've done with it. And people actually said, yes, it's so bad what we've done. You know? With no analysis, we just hang our heads down, especially when Master Clinton tells the Negro in the field that they have done something so wrong that even though they had a chance, they have messed it up. And just to quickly talk about that statement, one has to examine the words, Martin Luther King died for your freedom. Well, the first problem with that sentence is that Martin Luther King didn't die. You know, Martin Luther King was killed. And some of us think by the very government that Clinton was then representing. Matter of fact, most of us with half a brain think that. You know? And then there was a second part, he died for your freedom, and look what you've done with it, which presumes that somewhere after his death, we were free, and somewhere between that moment of freedom and that moment in 1993 when Clinton made that speech, we had messed up our freedom. It's an incredible statement. Now, a lot of you weren't even born in 1968 when Martin Luther King was killed. But I was around at that time. I remember April the 4th of 1968. I was in California. And Martin Luther King was planning the Poor People's Campaign. And he was planning it because he said we weren't free. So I know that by April the 4th, if I didn't think I was free or not free, Martin Luther King told us we were not free in America on April the 4th of 68 before he was struck down in Memphis. Now, I went to bed that night. And I woke up in the morning on April the 5th. And I didn't see a thing changed in the status of black people. And from that point forward, fought with the Black Panther Party and so forth, and did not see any fundamental change in the status of black people from that point until the days that Clinton was speaking. So the only thing I can conclude is that I slept through freedom that night after King was killed. We were freed in that night, and then we messed it up somewhere in the night between April the 4th and April the 5th, because that's the only time I could imagine we were free. We didn't get it. We messed it up. The audacity, the racism. But what Clinton said was, but I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you, because he says, look, Martin Luther King died for your freedom. Look what you've done with it. What are your problems? You have to break down the black family. People hung their heads in shame, never imagining the family might have been broken down way in 1600, snatched from the motherland against our will, and not even allowed to have family from that point forward. Have the nerve enough to talk to us about the breakdown. Secondly, there is that terrible unwed teen mother, Shaniqua and Chandrine and them, that everybody can really hate and get on top of and really just be just angry with, and she is a problem. And the third problem, the big one, is that insidious black-on-black crime. And Clinton said, but I'm going to help you with the third one, and the others too. But for now, we're going to focus on the third one, the black on black crime. Not only am I going to put more police in your neighborhoods, and everybody said, well, that's called the amen corner. He said, well, he said, not only am I going to do that, but I'm going to say, you commit big boy crime, you're going to do big boy time, we're going to put these little boys in prison. He said, that's right, that's the problem we have. And finally, we're going to start putting these people in prisons. You keep on committing crime, you keep on committing crime. 3 strikes, you're out. Prison population doubled in the United States of America, mostly of black men and so forth. And we can talk about this some more, but I think we have to understand that it's from that point to this. The creation of the prison industrial complex is only a part of that story. But the real story is the horrors of the ramifications of the 3 strikes crime bill as it plays itself out, not only among black men and women, but among black children also, including a boy about whom I wrote a book that was mentioned called The Condemnation of Little B. So there are also questions of the violation of the UN rights on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that this is the only country in the world that has not endorsed that, and we are the only country, therefore, who will put children in prison with adults, and that includes places like Rwanda and all those other brutal African savage countries that do all those terrible things, but this is the only country that will put children in prison with adults. And all of that has come from this 3 strikes crime bill, and as a result, we have this incredible number of people in prison in this country, mostly, or clearly disparate a number of whom are black men and women. So that's the end of my part, and we can talk about that more later. Thank you very much.
First, let me say it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and first time I've been on a panel with Elaine, although we've had a friendship, I guess, for about 15 years, and we can talk a little bit about how that evolved. But one of the things I think comes out of Elaine's life and her career and her dedication and her passion as she speaks tonight is an insistence on critical thinking, a critique of language, and to develop an analysis that will enable you to create the kind of mindset that will go out and do the kinds of things that will contribute to the welfare, in this case of the African American community, will certainly try to ameliorate a condition that one has to refer to as racism. In 1903, the great scholar and perhaps the greatest savant in this country in the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois, in a book, Souls of Black Folks, said the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And we now say, in 2007, that Du Bois was probably only wrong in his arithmetic, that it's going to be the problem of this century if we aren't careful. And I also think it behooves us to develop a definition of racism. I contend that every 3-year-old kid ought to have a little primer saying how to recognize a racist, how the racist performs, because often when we encounter that kind of bigotry, virulent as it can be on many occasions, we tend to internalize it. And we say, am I ugly, stupid, diseased? And strangely, the school system feeds right into that. So by the time you get that child in elementary school, junior high school, and even college, the individuals are marginalized to think that there's something wrong with him instead of the system. And so we need to look outward and look at that particular system. And I could go into a litany of the issues of the 20th century, and Festus did ask me to talk a little bit about some of the larger issues impacting upon the African American community. And I want to focus in on leadership, because I think one of the things we've been perhaps all too forgiving about is the lack of criticism of our African American leaders, and perhaps a corresponding demand, or lack of demand, to ask them about where are they going, what are they doing, what kind of analysis, who are we, and what are our objectives. And the great story of the Panther Party, and I really think, and Elaine has written a brilliant book, it really should be the Bible, not only for the party, but how you But I think there are several other books to be written about the Black Panther Party, because there were so many Black Panther members, young African American men and women, many of whom had not read fully, did not know theory, but they knew that there was something representative in the icon of Huey Newton or Elaine Brown. And I want to hone in on one particular individual who gave what I thought was correct analysis, but also some ways that one should think about change and concrete activity. And interestingly enough, it happened in part because of my own tenure as a faculty member at Spelman College. In the late 1980s, Janetta Cole went to Spelman College, and she was determined to make the all-girls institution something other than a grooming institution, something that goes beyond that, to politicize, to educate, to allow the women to think concretely about gender, race, ethnicity, what are the array of issues impacting upon them. And one of the most incredible things about teaching there is that often, because they were so bright, the students, we as scholars could go into the classroom, throw the intellectual ball in the air, and they would grab onto it and impose the kinds of questions that when we as the scholars came out of the classroom, we were, if we were listening and talking and dialoguing with them, we were much sharper in our analysis. And several of the children who were there, Elaine's daughter was there, one could go on and on and on. But I had the privilege of having the daughter of one of the most remarkable Black Panther Party members with whom you spoke yesterday morning, Eddie Ellis. And his daughter continued to raise the kinds of questions in the class that made me ask for a meeting with her. And in that meeting in my office, she explained to me who her father was, why he was incarcerated, and moreover, that if I wanted to write to him, correspond with him, that would be my opportunity. And so I latched on to that quickly, and we started to correspond. And even while incarcerated, and I think it was for reported murder of a policeman in New York City.
I honestly,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh,
I know you
yeah.
spent, what, 20-some years?
Yeah, and we did correspond, and he mailed me several articles that he had written within the penitentiary that came right out of the Black Panther Party ethos. And many of the things that you, Huey, and others were talking about, even while incarcerated, he continued to maintain the faith. And he was in Greenhaven, a correctional facility. And he formed a group of inmates to talk about what was the relationship between the larger African American community and the prison population. And he developed a thesis which he referred to as the direct relationship concept, that the two are symbiotic. You can't look at the prison population without looking at issues in the larger African American population. And you can't look at issues in the larger African American population without looking at the prison population. And so what he did was to form this intellectual think tank. And unlike many of you, I think many of the individuals who came out of my generation can allude to someone who's been incarcerated, a relative, a loved one, someone in your neighborhood. I can allude to two immediate individuals in my own family, and indeed in the 1960s, before we had the kind of supposed danger related to people visiting the penitentiary, had the opportunity to go into the courtyard in Baltimore, Maryland, Baltimore City Jail. And it was right after Elbridge Cleaver had published his book. And as I walked into the courtyard and stood there with a few other individuals, we saw this enormous talent among the prison population. We saw people who were reading, writing, playing chess. And what was painfully evident, we had these brilliant individuals who were thinking too why they were incarcerated. Who were they? Trying to make contact with their own family members. And the thing that was so evident was this brilliance. We see it in the writing. the think tank that Ellis put together in the penitentiary, he started to raise several kinds of questions about how do you deal with this problem, incarceration and the African American community. Elaine has enumerated some of the figures and some of the levels of incarceration, but the one that resonates with me most significantly is that the United States is 5% of the global population, but we have 25% incarceration rate. And of course, we're at the top, Russia, and then one can go down the line. So Eddie Ellis put together this group, and they started to raise all of these questions about what they were doing in the penitentiary and how they needed to think about either release, parole, or indeed what should go on within the penitentiary itself. And he raised several questions, and I'm actually borrowing heavily on his thought here, along with one of my PhD students who's written about the prison industrial complex. And the first thing Ellis said, and that came out of this think tank, and by the way, these articles later were published in the New York Sun and several areas, because the analysis was brilliant, and it was clear that people needed to read and reflect upon this outside of the penitentiary. The first thing he said, and I think it comes right out of the Black Panther Party, is that one had to focus on community control. And community control meant control of the institutions. And he defined, or said, one should define, develop, and defend the community, its own interests. And I see that as directly related to the party. The second thing he argued is that one had to summarily dismiss all of the bogus social scientists who were looking at this stuff as pathology within the African American community. And clearly, what you see in this refined thinking is this whole question of how you critique language, because I think that's one of the major problems within our universities today. We never take a long look at what language is being used and how it defines a particular group. Elaine and I can remember in the 80s, for example, when prior to that, a lot of African American women were having babies outside of wedlock. They labeled it pathology and so forth. And when it started to happen to white women, they labeled it alternative lifestyle. So it's a different kind of thinking, and all too many of our students, black, white, what have you, they run out of the classroom without challenging. They miraculously become authority at it, especially post-1980, and I'm sure probably before, but that's the period I want to look at. So Eddie and others challenged that kind of pathological routine to try to explain the incarceration rate among African Americans. And then thirdly, he went into the question of rehabilitation. And he pointed out eloquently, then as today, that approximately only 8 to 11% of the money poured in the prison industrial complex actually earmarked or going into rehabilitation. The overwhelming amount, 70%, to sustain the guards and now even certain communities. And so, in effect, what Wilson went on to say, that we need to think about the high incarceration rate and, of course, if you will, manumission or liberation for the inmates. But we also need to think about the question of, are they ready to be returned to the community? And the title of his essay is Incarceration Need Not Punish the Larger African American Community. And so he offered 4 things, and I'll conclude in a moment. First, that one needed a analysis that went beyond pathology, traditional analysis. 2, he went on to say that we needed to understand the link between the community and how one could train individuals who were incarcerated to come out of the penitentiary, have some skills, cognitive or trade, to go back into the community if you assume that the community is going to control the penitentiary and be able to define how it functions, where it's placed in the community, and what is its relationship between inmates coming out of the penitentiary and where are they going. So they needed to be trained educationally. And he laid this out brilliantly in a program. And then thirdly, he went on, and by the way, he's writing in the mid-1980s, he went on to point out that we need to look at who is profiting, what group is profiting by this military industrial complex and the prison complex. And he went on to point to the fact that whites are profiting by it. And he was clear about that. And then the last brilliant point he made is that the penitentiary sustains the livelihood of the guards. And so the guards have no vested interest in rehabilitation. And they are the ones who are subverting these rehabilitation programs. Their unions, they undermine it. Right now it's difficult to get a book in the penitentiary to read. And Elaine and I have a mutual friend. You would know him as H. Wright Brown. You know him as Imam Jamil Abdullah Alameen, who's on lockdown. And he gets out, what, 1 hour per day?
1 hour a day in a cage,
Yeah.
and it's in the early morning.
Right. And so the two things that came out of this brilliant essay, and it's interesting that it was written in 1988, but it applies to what the problems are today. 2 points that Ellis reiterated at the end. First, there must be community control of the prison system. Wherever that system may be placed, and he was making the assumption, of course, that if you have community control, it would be in the African American community, and blacks could determine institutionally what should go on and how the prison could be changed, be altered, what sort of leadership. And then the second thing is the whole question of re-socializing the individual to come out of the penitentiary and go back into society. And he also did his homework in terms of the statistics, because at that point his argument was that 93 to 97% of inmates will be out on the street at some point. They will be in the community. So it behooves the community to think about, what are you going to do? Because if you don't train them, if you don't think about rehabilitation, if you do not train the inmates, when they come out, they're on that treadmill, or that cycle, I should say, and they go back in. So I think that what I would like to see, universities becoming much more involved, because the other thing that we thought about in the 1980s, and this is the one area, by the way, Elaine, where Janetta threw me out of her office. I went to her after having read Eddie Ellis, and I said, one thing that Spelman could do clearly would be to get involved in helping young African American women who were released from the penitentiary. And if you allow me, I'll construct the program, which I will supervise, and we will bring them into Spelman College, and we will be able to construct a program that will, and it was an imaginative one, where we would provide child care and all the particulars. But this is where, and to get back to leadership, Janetta invoked a class analysis, meaning that the middle class and the upper class black community in Atlanta will not tolerate a Spelman College where you have recently released women coming into this university. So it gets complicated, many times a conundrum, and certainly convoluted. And I think we need to think about all of these matters. And I'll just end on one note. My mentor at Howard University, Dr. Rayford Logan, did a book in 1944, and it was titled, What the Negro Wants. And what Logan felt was that the African American community did not have an agenda to deal with all of these questions. So he went out and polled the most brilliant thinkers in the African American community. W.E. B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, Doc C. Wilkinson. They ranged from left to right. And they all wrote brilliantly about be. But I should note, they didn't touch the rate of incarceration for African American inmates. They didn't touch it at all. But this book was so powerful that when it was submitted to the editor, University of North Carolina Press, the editor read it and said, if this is what these Negroes want, they better think again because they aren't going to get it. And he refused to publish the book. Dr. Logan had to sue to get the book published. In the waning years of Dr. Logan, I ran to him and I said, we're at the 40th anniversary of the publication of this brilliant book, and perhaps we should do a sequel to it and go back into the black community and look at the ranking leadership today and raise the question, what should our agenda be? And so Dr. Logan and I embarked upon, his student or mentee, he my mentor, and unfortunately he died before we got we got all the essays. But here was the problem. If you think about black leadership in the 1980s, I call this so-called cadre of African American leaders. One told me the indolence was incredible. I don't have time to write that kind of essay. But if you come to my office and interview me, then take it back and transcribe it, and then mail it back to me, I'll contribute. I went to one, Benjamin Hooks, and he gave me a sermon in his office, a bad one at that. And when we finished the work, the vacuousness of their thinking, the empty thinking, no concept of what's going on in the African American community, seemingly unwillingness to look at it in a very clear way and think through the issues. So you juxtapose, finally our book could not be published because they didn't say anything. And you juxtapose it with what came out in 1944. And I think that those are some of the problems that we're grappling with today. The new kinds of demands that we need to make on the nominal so-called African American leadership to deal with some of these issues. And I want to commend, before concluding, Elaine Brown, because the way we became connected, I did my dissertation on her grandfather, who was Booker T. Washington's secretary, Henry Scott, and went from there to Howard University, did brilliant things, engineered the election of the first black president of Howard, got an enabling bill which guaranteed Howard federal funding, and he had either total recall or photographic memory, which I think Elaine has also. And I was reading her book in manuscript and got to a certain page, and she noted that she was connected to Dr. Scott. And Emmett Scott was brilliant. Carter Richmond said of Emmett Scott that he was the only African American who could walk upon snow without leaving footprints. And of course that was the way African Americans survived in that period. And I got to know Elaine, mesmerized by her own life. And yet beyond that, now when she's at home, she goes to the penitentiary every weekend to meet with little B. She's guiding him. She's offered the kind of support that he could not get from family. And so it shows that even today, she's committed to these precepts and concepts that she had when she was a young person. And the last thing I would like to note is, one, I'm glad you're here on a Friday afternoon. I'm not so sure about turning off the lights for a movie on a Friday afternoon unless it's something much more provocative than you have in mind. But I would like to commend the chairperson of the black programs here, Festus. I think if you can galvanize as many people as you've done on Friday night here, you should be off to a great start. And I hope that those of you here will support the program and make it do the kinds of things intellectually in the university and perhaps in the community and the state that will produce a society where indeed people can be competitive and precluded from certain opportunities owing to gender, race, ethnicity, or whatever the ism might be. So that's it for me, and I can respond, or I think we have to go to Tim.
Yeah.
Okay.
First, I'd like to say thank you. Also, I want to note that Huey Newton was a signal, so I'm proud to just be here and a part of this. And I also want to extend my honor of being here with Elaine Brown and also Dr. Dailey. I'd like to open up to the crowd. Any questions?
You mentioned about the government, say, creating criminals. I felt like, say, with the war on crime, they've created a way to create criminals. And as an example, maybe going back to 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act, you know, there weren't too many white people smoking pot in the 30s. It was all Mexicans or, you know, black populations were using pot. So this law they created was to give them an excuse to arrest a certain population. So question I wanted to ask, I know the government did everything they could to destroy the Black Panthers, killing and arresting them. And I've heard things like the CIA maybe leaking drugs like into Oakland or introducing an element, or I don't know if it's coke or smack, whatever people do, but giving the authorities a reason to arrest these people to help break down an organization they didn't like. I mean, would you comment on that?
Well, of course, I don't know what the CIA does. You probably have to ask somebody who was in the CIA, because that's one of the things that we start imagining stuff about what goes on. But we do know from some documented evidence from Gary Webb's brilliant work, now dead, a wonderful book called Dark Alliance, based on a series of articles that he, a journalist, wrote for the San Jose Mercury News, in which he absolutely documents the line between the introduction of massive quantities of cocaine into the black community by the CIA in support of the Contras in Nicaragua. Well, actually, they were based in Honduras, but they were the Nicaraguan Contras trying to get rid of the Sandinistas. And in order to build up the funding, according to Gary Webb's pretty documented reports, there was an effort to then to dump a whole bunch of cocaine into the black community. We certainly know or believe that one of the target cities was Oakland, California. And the reason we know that is because some of us observed suddenly in one community where you would have kids would be given bikes to ride, $250 bikes, you know, where they had no money before, women getting paid $50 a day to hold dope. We didn't know what it was, but we soon learned, and that I would put that at around 1976. This is the same time period when you find the creation of Ricky Ross's connection out of Southern California with the Crips and Bloods, who were really just street gangs, but they didn't have the kind of firepower they eventually had, and the whole rise in internecine community murders based on territorial claims to sell drugs. But the notion that black people were particularly susceptible to drugs is the one that you have to be careful of, because it smacks of racism. That is to say, we know that everybody in America is on crack just about today. All kinds of little blonde girls in Iowa, if they're not on crack, they're on meth. So the susceptibility question I would challenge. But the notion of dumping drugs into the black community and why that would be viable in a community that has no independent economy, and you have a bunch of young people walking around who know that they are pegged for either going to the joint for some small-time theft, or they're going to work at McDonald's, who have no vision of going to college or having a real role to play in their own lives. And in the absence of the Black Panther Party, as will be shown, I understand it, in a new HBO documentary called Bastards of the Party, The Rise of the Crips and Bloods. In the absence of something like the Black Panther Party, the dumping of these drugs allowed for a community that was absolutely bereft of any economy to develop a powerful economy in the sale of cocaine, which was inaccessible to us prior to that. Huey Newton, as everybody may know, if they know something about the Black Panther Party, was a user of cocaine. And so there's a theory that a lot of people like to claim that Huey was given the cocaine by the CIA or the FBI to kill Huey. There were all kinds of things that the government attempted to do to kill us, and that could have certainly been one of those things that was done. But Huey's descent into cocaine use didn't overwhelm him until many years after the party's effective demise. He was using cocaine, but it was not the same as freebasing and crack and so forth and so on when crack became cheap and he ultimately used that. So in answer to your question, I don't think that anybody in the Black Panther Party, I don't think that drugs took down the Black Panther Party. Let's put it to you like that. I do think that the crack cocaine epidemic among black people, among the black communities of America, has been a scourge almost equal to nothing other than, the only thing worse, perhaps, and that I say perhaps, was slavery itself. Because the ability of this drug to destroy even the most minimal relationships among our people, when you see the mother leaving the children for the use of crack, then you know that we have really lost everything. As Dr. Dailey suggested earlier, you know, one of the things that we had in the black community, even during slavery, was that we always knew auntie or somebody was going to take up the cudgel when nobody was there. If we had children born out of wedlock, somebody was going to absorb that child somewhere, and nobody was going to worry about what's going to happen to that child. But crack cocaine almost singularly created a culture of such death and destruction that I think that there hasn't been anything much worse than that. So yes, I think the CIA is certainly involved in that. And lastly, I want to say this about black leadership. There was a time when the Gary Webb articles were coming out that Maxine Waters, the congresswoman from the Maine area of Southern California where the Crips and Bloods are based, said that she was going to use that book to insist that there be congressional hearings on the CIA's link to crack cocaine and the black community. Now, you haven't heard about those hearings, have you? Well, that's because they didn't take place. Because the Congressional Black Caucus, which I like to think of as the Congressional Bootlicking Caucus, has done zip for black people that I can think of in the 30-some years that they have been in existence. It is they who supported the Three Strikes Crime Bill, led by Kwesi Mfume at the time that he was the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. So when Maxine Waters was the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, or chairwoman or whatever she called herself, and she was supposed to put on those hearings, which would have been bigger than Watergate, and which would have exposed the connection between this government and this scourge of crack cocaine, remembering that this country is the greatest consumer market of cocaine. You know, you don't run into France and Germany and any place in Africa and find a whole bunch of crackheads walking around. You know what I'm saying? This is the big consumer market. But Maxine became involved, as did the Congressional Black Caucus, in saving Bill Clinton from his terrible plight as he was about to be impeached. And they all talked about, she said, we are not going to let this president be impeached and taken out. We are going to put arms around Bill Clinton. As Charlie Rangel said, Harlem loves Bill Clinton. Speaking obviously for Charlie Rangel. And as the woman out of Texas, whatever her name is, said, and John Lewis even said that African Americans could understand the plight of Bill Clinton because we understood the injustice, comparing Bill Clinton's struggle, his comfort, to the struggle of black people for freedom. I mean, it was shameful. And they went all off into the sunset with Bill, worried about his house collapsing, or as Malcolm said, massive our house on fire, went off into the sunset with Bill Clinton and has never come back and said a mumbling word about the connection to drugs and the CIA and the black community. And so it is a complicated question, but the Black Panther Party's demise certainly came about because of government assaults and our own weaknesses and our own inability to just continue to stand up forever and ever, amen. But I don't think that we could peg it directly or singularly, let's say, to drugs.
I think, well, Elaine is absolutely right. You've got to remember that a systematic war was waged on the Panther Party and many satellite groups that were also in the country, and they weren't all black, too. That was a campaign that went after so-called radicalism. When Elaine and when I entered high school, and one had Dr. King and Malcolm X and everyone on the scene, we all thought that racism would be resolved by the time we got to 1968. You can see how confused we were. We learned along the way, but I would also say be very careful about essentializing, and you probably need to rethink or reprogram, because when you say black people are smoking pot in 1937 and whites are not, it raises a bevy of questions about who's getting caught, who's going to jail, and what we know about the white community. When we send social scientists into the community, they're always looking at black people, and they structure these bizarre theories. Some of them don't even go into the black community, and there are all too many blacks who don't go into the black community. You have a Skip Gates and no major campaign against little Skippy Gates, except the fact that he's an opportunist, and he's very clear about what he's in the game for. But you have black people at Harvard supposedly writing about the African American community. Do you ever see them in Harlem, in Watts, in Washington, D.C.? So I think we have to be very careful about what we're reading and how transparent what we're reading may be if we think it. And one other quote from Dick Gregory. One can take issue with some of his thinking today, but in the 1970s when he delivered that brilliant speech on the occasion of the shooting at Kent State, and I think it's something everybody should have to listen to before graduating from college, Gregory raised, among many other brilliant points, he said, how is it that any 4-year-old kid in the ghetto can tell you where the crack cocaine dealers are, where all the drugs being peddled, and the police can't find them. And so when you start to think about those questions, these are the kinds of questions we need to take into the classroom and be much more demanding. When I entered college in the 1960s, and Gregory said something else. He said that generation was saying to its professors, teach me how to live, and I'll worry about how to make a livelihood. In other words, give me some critical thinking skills. Give me a exposure to a value system, humanism, if you will. And now, when these kids come into the classroom, they say to you, in sometimes very profound ways, very clear terms, what is it that I need to do to pass this course? And the obvious answer is think, but that's something anathema to them. They want to manipulate, and I know I'm generalizing here, but we're finding it all too often in the classroom now, where there's hardly any dialogue going on, and hence we get the kind of fragmented thinking that I think is all too endemic to our society when we start to look at the black-white question. And also depends on the focus and who are the people conducting the research. All the money being poured into studying these problems, they don't go to the community people who really probably have the expertise and could speak, if you will, ex cathedra about all of these matters. So I would challenge the individuals in our modern world to, if you will, make that paradigm shift and start to recognize that you sit in front of the television, you read the New York Times, what you're getting often really does not pass for analysis, and that's why we come up with these kinds of observations that blacks aren't doing this and that. My mentor, David Lewis, a brilliant young scholar who won the Pulitzer Prize for a 2-volume work on W.B. Du Bois, looked at the problem of drugs in the American community in the 1920s, period from 1900 to 1920. And they found that a lot of, and I should be a little bit more clear about the number, but significant number of white women, when their daughters and sons came home, they were irritable and angry and hostile. And after dinner, they were serene and passive. Well, these moms were getting high, and they were ordering the commodity from Sears and Roebuck. It wasn't Coke, it was, no, it wasn't, well, a derivative of it. But they were ordering it from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And this was a project sponsored by Johns Hopkins University. And so what you do is you turn the camera around and say, if we're going to compare, then let us know more. And I just want to end this segment by saying one thing. When I was in school in Baltimore with my dear wife, frequently when I was the lone black in the classroom, the teacher would raise the race question and would say, who's going to answer this? And would look at me. And I would look around. And finally I became somewhat, even my perfunctory thinking at that point, bold enough to say, well, I didn't create the problem. Why don't you ask the people here who created it? And Elaine raised something, I think, that was, well, Elaine and I had the most incredible experience this afternoon, and somehow Elaine sparked a kind of dialogue, and several of the students are here now, and I'm happy for them to be here. But we entered a dialogue I've never been in at UTEP, and I don't think I've been in any college campus, where we had 9, among many others, 9 black men in a classroom, and 3 of them noted that their fathers were on death row. Out of 9, 3. And so then you start, you recall that?
Of course.
Yeah, and then you start thinking, well, what is going on? And then you have to tell them that it's an incredible achievement to be here. And they've got to understand who they are, where they're going. But they also need a kind of belief, because no one is going to reinforce that thinking. They go into classrooms and they're told essentially pathological, you're the problem, and so forth. So they don't get that kind of reinforcement. And you have to say it. And one final thing. We've looked at the education of young black men in the society. And we have to, and women too, and we have to look at the politics of it. We start to find that young black men they seem to become a threat to the teacher around the 3rd grade. And that's when eagerly they throw up their hands to answer a question, and the teacher will go to someone else. And then you find those students moving to the back of the classroom. And by the time they get to high school in Atlanta, when I invited a Tuskegee Airman to come and speak, and as episodic as that story was, the moment he started to speak, the students put their heads down on the desk. And he paused and he said, what's going on here? And they said, in effect, that their teachers told them, if you come into classroom and you're not obstreperous, and you go to sleep, you'll pass with a C.
Mm.
And so when they come into college, this is something Jamil said to me. He said, these students are brain dead in the university. And so you have to then start looking at these issues. And they're issues that we all have to look at as a society. Don't think that, and while I condemn a certain segment of black leadership, it also raises the larger questions about those, as Malcolm would say, who are crying crocodile tears for Clinton and not looking at some of the larger issues pertaining to it. And we could go into that.
Right.
I think there was a question.
Probably plenty more questions. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that many of us can appreciate historical black figures, as you mentioned before, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Hard to hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'll speak louder. I was saying that I'm pretty sure that many of us can appreciate black historical figures, such as the person that you mentioned, W.E.B. Du Bois, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Garvey, Frederick Douglass. But personally, me coming up in the 80s and in the 90s, and a lot of us can identify more with contemporary culture. So what I was wondering was, you mentioned an author. A lot of the contemporary authors that we're reading today are people like Michael Eric Dyson, Cornel West, Lee Jones, J.W. Wiley. But and another thing that you mentioned regarding African American culture was crack cocaine, which is a very relevant and very important issue in African American culture. What I want to know is your thoughts on hip hop culture and contemporary issues that people that are mostly in this room, such as myself, who came up in the 80s and 90s, can identify with. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, what we say in the academic community, if you like hip hop, we say we're hip hop aficionados.